In agriculture, the Sumerians created irrigation practices, the seed drill, the plow, and the pickaxe, and seem to have also invented the device known as the Archimedes Screw long before the Greeks. The Archimedes Screw is a device which draws water from lower to higher levels, such as groundwater to irrigation ditches. Brewing and the brewer's vat also developed from agricultural practices, as beer is thought to have been discovered through fermented grains. The Sumerians also invented a governmental bureaucracy which oversaw and regulated production and distribution of crops. Kramer notes, while the Sumerians set a high value on the individual and his achievement, there was one overriding factor which fostered a strong spirit of cooperation among individuals and communities alike: the complete dependence of Sumer on irrigation for its well-being, indeed, for its very existence. Irrigation is a complicated process requiring communal effort and organization. Canals had to be dug and kept in constant repair. The water had to be divided equitably among all concerned. To ensure this, a power stronger than the individual landowner or even the single community was mandatory. Hence, the growth of governmental institutions and the rise of the Sumerian state. The concept of the state grew out of small communal organizations known as households, whose members were not all blood relatives but shared a common interest and, usually, some amount of land. A strict hierarchy governed the households with a big man, known as an ensi and later a lugal, at the top, his wife below him, and others following down to unskilled laborers. The initial households eventually developed into the ruling houses as cities developed and the concept of kingship emerged. The cities were centered on the temple complex, and these complexes called for the development of monumental architecture to honor the gods who would live in them. Each city had its own temple and its own god, and each needed their temple complex to be more impressive than any others. The temple aside, though, cities required buildings with doorways, hallways, and rooms, and some means had to be found to fashion these. Scholar Stephen Bertman explains how this challenge was met. The engineering solution proved to be the arch, a Sumerian invention of the 4th millennium BCE. The arch created an opening while at the same time bearing weight. Its secret was to transfer that weight outward and then downward into the ground, rather than bearing it solely upon itself. By building a series of such arches back to back, engineers were able to construct vaults that served as tunnels. In addition to forming passageways, the arch was a strong and efficient way of supporting a superstructure. Because of its openness, it required less brick or stone than a wall of similar size carrying a similar weight. Mathematics probably developed from trade as a necessity in bookkeeping, but was clearly an important aspect of architecture in planning and constructing cities and their temples. In the course of building these great cities and grand structures, the Sumerians seem to have invented the mathematical paradigm of the Pythagorean Theorem centuries before Pythagoras lived. This is hardly surprising, since Mesopotamian cities were well known as great centers of learning and culture, most notably Babylon from c. 1792, c. 600 BCE, where the Greek philosopher Thales of Miletus was said to have studied. The Mesopotamians developed a highly sophisticated mathematical system with a sexagesimal place notation, a base of 60, whereas the present-day base is 10. This system included addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, algebra, geometry, reciprocals, squares, and quadratic equations. The sexagesimal base inspired them to create time based on the concept of 60, and so an hour was defined as 60 minutes and a minute of 60 seconds. Time was measured by a sundial or a water clock, and the period of the sun's rising to setting and rising again was divided into periods of 12 for daylight and 12 for darkness, creating the 24-hour day. These days were then calculated to make up a year, and in order to know what times of the year were optimal for what activities, astronomy developed to chart the stars and tell the seasons, and this led to the creation of the calendar. The Mesopotamians used a lunisolar calendar in which each month begins with the first sighting of the crescent moon. Initial attempts to define a year fell short of a true solar year, but by the 17th century BCE, astronomy had developed to the point where a year, as well as other cycles of time, were well defined. The charting of the stars was interpreted, like everything else, as acting in accord with the will of the gods, and so it was only natural that, eventually, diviners would come to interpret certain astronomical phenomena as messages from the gods, and so astrology was created. Divination had been practiced in Mesopotamia prior to the creation of astrology through the sacrifice of animals and interpreting their entrails or similar methods. Astrology, however, came to dominate divination because the signs were seen as a clearer message directly from the gods regarding a nation's or an individual's future and even character. The signs of the zodiac and determining a person's basic characteristic and short and long-term fate were concepts first created in Mesopotamia before being developed later by the Egyptians and the Greeks.